Walk into any American elementary school hallway in 1975 and the first thing that hits you is the color. Not muted, not careful, not coordinated, just loud, saturated, almost aggressive color on shirts, on jackets, on the very carpet under the kids' feet. This was a decade that had just watched the buttoned-up conformity of the 1950s and early 60s get torn apart, and school fashion for kids reflected that shift almost overnight. Corduroy, polyester, wide collars, platform shoes on 10-year-olds, and a level of pattern clashing that would give a modern parent a headache just looking at old class photos. None of it was accidental either. What kids wore to school in the 1970s was shaped by real forces. Oil price shocks that changed what fabrics cost, a booming synthetic textile industry desperate to prove itself, and a cultural mood that had decided childhood clothing did not need to look like miniature adult clothing anymore. So what did American kids actually wear walking through those school doors? Why did it look so different from the decade before it? And which single garment from this era became so common, so cheap, and so despised by the kids forced to wear it, that its name still makes people wince 50 years later? We are counting down 15 things that defined what American kids wore to school throughout the 1970s. One honest word before we start. Fashion trends of any decade are never uniform. What a kid wore in rural Kansas in 1972 looked different from what a kid wore in a Los Angeles suburb the same year, and family income made an enormous difference in whether a household bought new clothes at a department store or made do with hand-me-downs and home sewing. So take this list as the broad national picture built from what was actually manufactured, advertised, and sold in bulk during the decade, not a claim that every single kid in America dressed exactly alike. What is certain is that every item on this list was common enough, and distinctive enough, that anyone who was a school-age kid during this decade will recognize it instantly. Number 15. The polyester leisure suit, scaled down for boys. The leisure suit defined adult men's fashion in the mid-1970s, and clothing manufacturers, seeing an obvious opportunity, quickly began producing smaller versions for boys as young as 5 or 6, complete with the same wide lapels, the same boxy cut, and the same shiny polyester fabric that barely breathed and held static electricity like nothing before it. A boy dressed for school picture day in this era stood a real chance of showing up in a miniature version of exactly what his father wore to the office, right down to the matching vest. The material itself became almost synonymous with the decade, cheap to produce, resistant to wrinkles, and available in colors that no natural fiber had ever comfortably existed in: mustard yellow, burnt orange, avocado green. Department stores sold these small suits in genuine volume through the middle of the decade, before changing tastes and a general backlash against synthetic fabric pushed the style out by the early 1980s. Number 14. The prairie dress. For girls, one of the defining silhouettes of the decade was the prairie dress, a long, high-necked, often ruffled garment inspired directly by 19th-century pioneer clothing, popularized by designers responding to a broader cultural nostalgia for a simpler, more rural version of America. School-age girls wore shortened, more practical versions of this look, usually falling to the knee rather than the ankle, but keeping the same puffed sleeves, small printed floral patterns, and high collars that made the style instantly recognizable. The look drew directly from television, with shows set in earlier American eras influencing what mothers chose to buy their daughters, and department store catalogs throughout the decade regularly featured entire sections built around this pioneer-inspired aesthetic. Number 13. Corduroy pants in every color imaginable. If polyester defined the shiny, synthetic side of 1970s school fashion, corduroy defined its heavier, more textured counterpart, and boys in particular wore corduroy pants constantly, in colors that went well beyond the traditional browns and tans of earlier decades into bright rust orange, forest green, and deep maroon. The wide wale corduroy popular through the middle of the decade had thick, clearly visible ridges running down the fabric, giving pants a bold textured look that showed up in nearly every school hallway across the country. Corduroy was durable, relatively affordable, and held up well to the kind of daily wear a school-age kid put clothing through, which made it a practical staple for parents even as the colors themselves grew increasingly bold as the decade progressed. Number 12. The wide, exaggerated shirt collar. Few single details scream 1970s as loudly as the shirt collar of this era. Dramatically wide, often pointed sharply enough to reach halfway to the shoulder, worn open over the top button on both boys' and girls' dress shirts alike. Photographs from school picture day throughout the decade show an almost startling consistency in this detail. Regardless of the rest of the outfit, the collar itself sat wide and flat, frequently worn outside a sweater or jacket rather than tucked beneath it. Clothing manufacturers leaned hard into this exaggerated tailoring detail because it photographed dramatically and signaled, even on a child, that the wearer was dressed in something current rather than something left over from an earlier decade. Number 11. Platform shoes, including for kids. Platform shoes are usually remembered as an adult disco-era trend, but the style trickled down into children's footwear throughout the middle of the decade, with school-aged kids, particularly older elementary and junior high students, wearing shoes with a noticeably raised sole and heel that would look genuinely unusual on a child today. Parents and shoe stores marketed these as a fun, current style rather than anything impractical, even though the raised sole created real balance challenges on school playgrounds and stairs. The trend peaked around the middle of the decade alongside the broader disco-influenced fashion moment, and while it never became as extreme in children's sizes as in adult footwear, the basic raised sole silhouette was genuinely common in school hallways for several years. Number 10. The turtleneck under everything. Long before it became a specific fashion statement, the turtleneck was simply practical everyday school wear throughout the 1970s, worn constantly by both boys and girls, often in a single solid color underneath a jumper, a vest, or a light jacket. Turtlenecks came in the same bold, saturated color range as the rest of the decade's clothing, and layering one under a sleeveless sweater vest became such a standard combination that entire school class photos from this era show rows of kids in nearly identical color-blocked layers. The style was warm, practical for changeable indoor and outdoor temperatures, and cheap enough to buy in multiple colors, which made it a genuine staple rather than a passing trend. Number 9. Iron-on transfer t-shirts. The 1970s saw a genuine explosion in a new kind of casual school shirt, plain t-shirts decorated with iron-on transfers, images and slogans pressed onto the fabric using a home iron, sold through mail-order catalogs, craft stores, and mall kiosks specifically built around this new technology. Kids wore shirts featuring cartoon characters, sports logos, rainbow graphics, and sometimes genuinely strange novelty slogans that parents let slide in a way that would raise eyebrows today. This was one of the first times mass customization became genuinely available to ordinary families. A kid could walk into a mall kiosk and walk out 20 minutes later with a shirt that existed nowhere else, and school hallways throughout the decade filled up with an enormous variety of these individually decorated shirts. Number 8. Denim overalls for both boys and girls. Overalls moved decisively out of purely rural, workwear territory during this decade and into mainstream school fashion for kids of both genders. Worn over turtlenecks or t-shirts, often with wide flared legs matching the broader silhouette popular throughout the era. Denim overalls offered genuine practicality for active kids, room to move, sturdy fabric that held up to playground wear, and pockets that could actually hold things, which made them a favorite among parents even as they carried a clear fashion statement of their own. Catalogs and department stores throughout the decade regularly featured overalls prominently in back-to-school sections, presenting them as a current, versatile option rather than simply practical farm clothing repurposed for suburban kids. Number 7. The knee sock and short combination for boys. Before long pants became the near-universal standard for boys at school, a genuine holdover style persisted through parts of the decade, particularly in the earlier years, short pants paired with knee-high socks, especially common in more formal school settings and among younger boys. This combination had been standard boys' wear for generations before the 1970s, but it was fading out steadily throughout the decade as long pants became increasingly normalized for boys of all ages. School photographs from the early part of the decade still regularly showed this older style, while photographs from the later years show it becoming increasingly rare, a visible marker of changing norms captured in real time across just a few years of class pictures. Number 6. The hand-knit or hand-crocheted sweater vest. Home sewing and knitting remained a genuinely common household skill throughout the 1970s, and a significant portion of school kids wore sweater vests, ponchos, or cardigans made by a mother or grandmother rather than purchased at a store. These homemade pieces often featured bold geometric patterns, popular yarn colors of the specific years they were made, and a level of individual variation that mass-produced clothing simply could not match, meaning two kids in the same class might own genuinely one-of-a-kind garments even though the general style looked similar across the whole school. Pattern books and yarn companies specifically marketed to this home crafting audience throughout the decade, publishing seasonal patterns aimed directly at parents making clothing for school-aged children. Number 5. Bell-bottom and flared jeans. The flared silhouette that defined 1970s fashion generally applied just as strongly to children's clothing, and jeans cut with a distinct flare from the knee down were standard school wear for both boys and girls through most of the decade. Denim itself became increasingly common as an everyday school fabric rather than something reserved strictly for weekend or farm wear, a genuine shift from the more formal dress code norms of the previous decade. The flare width itself changed year to year as the trend evolved, starting relatively modest early in the decade and growing more dramatic through the middle years before beginning to narrow again as the decade came to a close, giving genealogists of fashion a fairly reliable way to date old-school photographs just from the width of a kid's pant leg. Number 4. The puffy vest over a plaid flannel shirt. As the decade progressed into its later years, a distinct layered look became common in school hallways, particularly in colder climates. A sleeveless quilted vest, often filled with synthetic insulation rather than down, worn over a plaid flannel or plain long-sleeve shirt. This combination offered genuine warmth without restricting arm movement, practical for kids moving between overheated classrooms and cold outdoor recess, and it appeared constantly in mail-order catalogs marketed specifically toward active school-aged children. The style carried forward strongly into the following decade, but its roots as a standard 1970s school outfit are clear in class photographs from the second half of the decade onward. Number 3. Saddle shoes making a brief comeback. Though most strongly associated with earlier decades' saddle shoes, the two-toned lace-up style with a contrasting panel across the middle of the shoe experienced a genuine minor revival among some school-aged kids during parts of the 1970s, particularly among younger girls in more traditional or private school settings. Some schools with stricter dress codes specifically favored saddle shoes as an approved footwear option, keeping the style alive in certain communities even as platform shoes and sneakers dominated more broadly elsewhere. The style never returned to the dominance it held decades earlier, but its persistence in specific school settings throughout the decade shows how unevenly fashion trends actually spread across different communities and dress code environments. Number 2. The tube top and hot pants combination for older girls. Among junior high and early high school age girls, particularly by the middle and later years of the decade, a distinctly more grown-up school fashion trend emerged, tube tops paired with hot pants or very short shorts, a combination that generated real controversy and led many school districts to introduce or tighten dress codes specifically in response. This trend reflected a broader loosening of what was considered acceptable clothing for younger teenagers, driven partly by adult fashion trends trickling down and partly by a genuine generational shift in attitudes about modesty and self-expression. School administrators throughout the decade wrestled publicly with where to draw dress code lines, and this specific combination became something of a flashpoint in that ongoing argument between kids testing new freedoms and schools trying to maintain some sense of traditional order. Number 1. The dreaded Toughskins jeans from Sears. No single clothing item defines the practical, unglamorous reality of 1970s schoolwear quite like Sears brand Toughskins jeans, heavily marketed directly to parents rather than kids, built from an unusually stiff, reinforced denim specifically designed to survive months of playground abuse without wearing through at the knees. Sears backed the product with an actual guarantee, promising to replace the jeans for free if they wore out before a child outgrew them, a genuinely unusual level of confidence in a piece of children's clothing that became a real selling point for budget-conscious families throughout the decade. Kids, however, largely hated wearing them. The stiff fabric took weeks to soften up, the fit ran noticeably boxy compared to more fashionable jeans, and being known as a kid in Toughskins carried a very real social weight in school hallways increasingly focused on brand-name denim. Sears sold an enormous volume of these jeans throughout the decade regardless, making Toughskins arguably the single most commonly worn specific clothing item among American school kids of this entire era. Loved by parents, for their durability, and quietly resented by nearly every kid forced to wear them. 15 items, 15 small pieces of a decade that dressed its children in the boldest colors and boldest patterns American clothing had ever attempted, from a shiny polyester leisure suit on a 6-year-old to a pair of stiff, guaranteed Sears jeans that no kid actually wanted to wear. None of these choices were really made by the kids themselves. They were made by parents working with a specific budget, a specific set of options on department store racks, and a genuine cultural moment that had decided childhood clothing did not need to look conservative or restrained anymore. The kids just wore what they were given, the same way kids in every decade before and since have worn whatever their own parents chose off whatever racks happened to be available that year. If you went to school during this decade, tell us in the comments what you actually wore, and whether you loved it at the time or only appreciate it looking back now. And if there is an item from this era we missed here, one that defined your own school hallway that never made this list, tell us what it was and where you remember wearing it.